All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're starting just a few minutes late. We're trying to figure out a technical issue we're having on our end, but I don't want to take too much time to get going here. So welcome and good afternoon. This is going to be our April installment of NDSBA's Lunch and Learn series. My name is Amy DeCook. I'm in-house legal counsel for North Dakota School Boards Association. Today we're going to talk about school district elections. That's a very broad topic, and but we only have an hour today. So I'm going to try and hit what I think would be most relevant to all that are on the line. Before we get started, I would really enjoy it if we had a little bit more interaction rather than me just talking a bunch today. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the hour and as they arise as we're talking today. I'd ask that you use the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar to ask any questions. And then if you're having any technical difficulties with the presentation, please use the chat feature for that. Rebecca from our office is on the line as well, and she'll kind of be watching out for those questions. But any questions about the substance, please put in the Q&A, and I'll do my best to field those while we're talking today. So let's get started. Again, like I said, school elections can take much more than an hour to go through. There's a lot of moving parts to deal with, but I kind of picked what I thought would be the most relevant to the mix of people we probably have on today. So we're just going to cover initially just a few basics about school district elections, and then spend a good amount of time on election procedures. And that's really going to be pre-election requirements and deadlines all the way up into election day. Talk a little bit about what happens on election day, and then what the board's responsibilities are post-election day. And then we'll finish up with some brief information about school board candidates and some information about election corrupt practices. So let's go and start with some basic information. So when I refer to school election, what do I mean? Basically, that's any election that's held under the authority of a school board in North Dakota. And it kind of falls in one of four hats. And it's the main one being to elect board members to the school board, authorize additional taxation, authorize issuance of bonds, and then submit specific questions or propositions to the district electors. So if you want the electors to pass on a question, and we'll kind of talk about what that looks like a little bit later, that would also be a reason to have a school election. Okay, so when must a school election be held? Every school board in North Dakota, public school board in North Dakota, is required to hold an annual election sometime between April 1st and June 30th of each year. I oftentimes will get a call from usually a school district business manager saying that, well, we don't have anybody up for election, so do we have to have our annual election this year? And my answer to that is, you should never have a year where you don't have at least one seat up for election. Proper staggering of board member terms ensures that you have at least one seat up every year. And so, yes, you should always have at least one seat, which would necessitate an annual election every year. In addition to the annual election, North Dakota law allows school boards to hold a special election at any time for any lawful purpose. So here are some additional purposes for holding elections where that special election may be necessary. And I've listed a handful here, but there are more than just this. But a few of these are the more common. So filling board vacancies is a really common special election. That's a little bit different than if you have a vacancy and the board appoints someone to fill the vacancy, and then a successor is then elected at the next regular election. Appointment can be made also by special election instead of board action. So that's one reason for a special election. Recall is another common purpose for elections. School district reorganization, that's something that comes up periodically. We've had a few of those in the last couple of years. Bond measures, of course, special elections. Some of these can also be held, or questions like these can be put to the voters at the annual election as well, at your regular election. But they can also be held separately in a special election. So who oversees a school election? And I think this is important to kind of know, what role does the board play versus the school district business manager. Those are kind of the two entities that are going to have regular responsibilities when it comes to school elections. So starting with the school board first, ultimately the school board is responsible for holding a proper election. It's a school election, it's under the authority of the school board, and so ultimately the board is responsible that the election is conducted properly. The board sets the date of any election, including the annual election every year. Most districts schedule their annual election on the second Tuesday of June, which is the primary election date for statewide elections in North Dakota. The school board gets to determine what questions are put to the voters. So if there's a bond measure, the board gets to determine whether that gets put to the voters. If there is a school district reorganization, the school boards of each of the districts to be reorganized decide that those questions are put before the voters. There are also some instances in North Dakota law where a petition can be signed by a certain number of electors to get a question before the voters. So there's a little bit of a caveat there, but overall the board is going to be the one that that brings questions to the voters. And then the school board will act as the canvassing board following election day. I put the word except there because as many of you likely know, school boards can hold their annual elections along with a city election or a county primary election in June. There are provisions in North Dakota law that allow for that. In those instances, once there's an agreement reached that the board and the county, for example, will hold their elections together, it's the county then that takes over the administration of the election. And so the school districts had very little involvement after the agreement is reached to conduct the elections together. I'm not going to go through I'm going to focus on school district elections that are conducted and administered by the school district and not by the county or city, but it is an option that you have. I think last annual election, I think about 25% of our districts in North Dakota conducted their elections along with the county, but a large majority still conduct their own elections. All right, now what about the school district business manager? So the school district business manager is the election official for school board or school district elections. And that means that that person is responsible for administering the election and overseeing the actual conduct of the election as it progresses once the election date is set. So for example, the school board or the school district business manager is responsible for meeting all of the statutory deadlines and requirements. That person prepares the ballot, they process absentee voter applications. Again, there's an exception here if the school election is held in conjunction with the county or city election. In those cases, again, the county or the city the county auditor or the city auditor then takes over as the election official. And so the school business manager will not play that official role. But for our purposes today, the school business manager is the school official, excuse me, the election official, and will be responsible for overseeing or actually meeting the various deadlines and requirements that we're going to talk about today. Okay, so let's move on to election procedures. I think, you know, I think we all kind of think that we have a general understanding of how school elections are to run, but you'd be surprised at the calls I get that, you know, we sometimes miss a few steps. And so I think it's important to run through these. Before we get into the specific requirements and deadlines, it's important to note that all of these requirements and deadlines, with a few exceptions, are going to apply not only to the annual elections that you hold every year, but also to any special election. And that's kind of regardless of the issue on the ballot. However, there are going to be some exceptions to that. And there may actually be some additional requirements or steps depending on what the issue is that's on the ballot. North Dakota law provides that unless otherwise provided, a school district election must be conducted and the votes must be canvassed in the same manner as the election of a county officer. So a lot of the requirements are going to mirror what a county election would look like. And so that means we're going to have to refer to the election title of the code, Title 16.1, for a lot of our direction, requirements, deadlines when it comes to school elections. As I think many of you know, every year, prior to election season, we at NDSBA put out a sample school board election deadline calendar to assist our districts to make sure that you guys are aware. Here are the deadlines that we need to keep in mind. This on the screen is our 2021 school board election calendar. I believe we send that out in our bulletin every year prior to the kind of the expected election deadlines. Our sample is drafted with the expectation that you're going to hold your annual election on the second Tuesday of June. So in this example, it would be June 8th, 2021. And we build the pre-election deadlines off of that date. But if you can hold it any time between April 1st and June 30th, so if your election date is different from the second Tuesday, you'd have to reconfigure these deadlines. But it's something to kind of help remind you, hey, we need to be aware of all of these steps so that we can conduct an appropriate election. Okay, so I thought it'd be the best to kind of go through this step by step from beginning to end and to kind of give a full picture of what and I'm going to focus on the annual election. But again, a lot of these deadlines are still going to apply to any special election that you have as well, with some exceptions. So the first step is generally going to be setting the date of the election. Again, the board is responsible for setting that election every year, that election date, sometime between April 1st and June 30th. Again, typically for most of our districts, they select the second Tuesday in June because most folks are out and ready to go vote on the second Tuesday. One thing to keep in mind is that when you're setting an election date, including the annual election, you need to consider all of the statutory filing and publication deadlines to make sure you leave enough time in advance of the election date to make sure that your school district business manager can comply with all of the necessary deadlines. So the first one, kind of going back to our election calendar, the first one to keep in mind is that 94 days before the election. And that is, you have to provide published notice of the upcoming deadline to file for candidates to submit their names to be on the ballot. And so 94 days is kind of the key there. It's possible for some special elections that you won't have any candidate filings because maybe it's just a bond measure, so you wouldn't have that, have to worry about that candidate filing deadline. so you wouldn't have to comply with that notice for that particular election. But if you are scheduling an election for a recall, you not only have the question of whether to recall the particular member, but you also have the opportunity for candidates to put their names in the event that the recall goes through. So in that case, you would comply with that 94-day deadline. So just something to keep in mind. The next step is that 94-day deadline that I mentioned, the notice of candidate filing deadline. 30 days before the filing deadline, the school district business manager is required to publish an official notice in your official notice, a notice in the official newspaper, alerting the public, your electors, that in 30 days, candidates must file their required documents in order to be on the ballot as a candidate. And the 30 days is counted back from the 64 days prior to the election. That's the filing deadline. So that's how we get to that 94 days. So the notice has to be published again 94 days before the election. One thing to keep in mind is you should be aware of your official newspaper's deadline for submission to make sure that you're not going to run into a problem to make sure that that notice is published in time to comply. And sometimes newspapers have different schedules in terms of when you need to file or submit something for it to get into to their publication. So always keep in mind what your newspaper deadlines might be. I've included here a sample publication notice. This is just suggested language, but you certainly can adjust it to fit your needs. But this is a sample notice of filing deadline that you would publish. And you can get, if you need copies of this, or I can certainly send this to you by email. And I forgot to mention that all of this information, the recording, the slides, everything will be available to you on our website following today's presentation. So the next step is the actual filing deadline. And there are a few things that candidates are required to file. First, they are required to, anybody that's seeking election to the board must prepare and sign a document that states their name and the position for which they are, they would like to be a candidate for. And this is commonly referred to as the statement of intent. There are state forms that you can use, that one being the affidavit of candidacy, and that's state form 2703. So if someone comes to the school district business manager asking for whatever documents they need to fill out to be a candidate, that would be one that you can provide to them or direct them to. You can create your own form as a district, or the individual candidate can create their own form, but it's much easier just to give them access or direct them to the state form. In addition to the statement of intent, the candidate is also required to file a statement of interest, as is required by section 16.10902. And again, there is a state form for that one as well, which I've listed here. And that one just requires them to provide some personal information, business affiliates, their occupation, those types of things, so that the electors could have some information about the candidate in considering whether they'll vote for them. So that's kind of the purpose of that document. Both of those required filings have to be filed with the school district business manager or mailed to and in the possession of the business manager no later than 4 p.m. on the 64th day before the election. So that's key. If they don't meet that deadline, their name can't be put on the ballot. I've included a sample affidavit of a candidacy form. Again, this is a state. This one is isn't the state form. It's one that was created by a district, which you're allowed to do, but it matches very, it may even be very almost exactly like the state form, but just an example. Okay, so once that candidate filing deadline has come and passed, one thing I should mention, if you receive multiple candidates, there is a requirement under North Dakota law in chapter 15.109, that's the school board chapter of the code, that talks about how you determine the order on of which the individuals will be listed on the ballot. So there is that requirement as well. If you have some additional questions on that, please feel free to give me a call and I can send that information to you. But once the candidate filing deadline comes and goes, the next thing that you'll need to be aware of, particularly your business manager, is the preparation and printing of the ballot. And a couple of deadlines to keep in mind here. The general ballot deadline is at least 40 days before the election. So no later than 40 days before the election. The business manager is required to prepare and cause to be printed or otherwise uniformly reproduced the official ballot, which contains all of the individuals that completed that statement of intent and statement of interest within the timelines required. So that's the ballot preparation deadline. A question here, do you need to publish the ballot? No, you don't need to publish the ballot. You do need to provide a notice of election, which we will provide, we'll cover here in a second, but no, you do not need to publish a copy of the ballot in your official newspaper. There are a few requirements that the ballot has to contain. It has to be nonpartisan in form. That's important for school district elections. And then there are a list of other requirements. It has to say official ballot, has to include the school district name, the date of the election, the number of persons to be elected to each office, and then a list of the candidates, with also a blank for write-in candidates as well. So those are the statutory requirements as to what needs to be included in the ballot. Okay, some additional ballot deadlines to keep in mind. So for our military and overseas citizens or resident voters, ballots have to be available to those folks at least 46 days before the election. So you're actually preparing a ballot. You have that 40-day ballot preparation deadline, but it's actually, if you anticipate military or overseas electors wanting to vote, you're going to have that ballot prepared at least 46 days before the election. And then absentee ballots must be available for at least 40 days before the election. So that corresponds with the general ballot preparation deadline. But I'm not going to get into absentee voting today. I thought about including that, but it's a cumbersome process and it was way too long to include in the hour of discussion. But if you have any questions on absentee voting, please let me know. There are some changes that are likely going to be made by the Legislative Assembly this session. There's still a very large election administration bill that's working through conference committee right now that will likely have some changes in how you process absentee ballots. I can certainly provide that information or answer any questions, but we will be providing our legislative update every week, and then we'll be providing some guidance on some particular bills once legislative session ends. And I believe we're also holding a lunch and learn series with a legislative update in a couple of months. So keep a lookout for that. So additional ballot deadlines to keep in mind. Okay, so once the ballot deadline has come and gone, the next thing that actually the board must do is two things: designating one or more precincts for the election and then designating one or more polling places. Both of these have to occur at least 35 days prior to the election date. I believe it's pretty common for most districts to only designate one precinct and to only designate one polling place. But you know, that's going to vary depending on the size and makeup of your district. If, you know, you have voters spread out over a large geographic area, if you have a lot of land in your district and you have voters all over the place, that might be a key, a time where you would want to designate more than one polling place in a particular precinct to make sure that you are locating polling places as conveniently as possible for the voters in the precinct. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing this. But that has to occur again at least 35 days prior to the election. That has to occur. Let's say that you always hold your election the second Tuesday of every year, in June every year, and you always have the same number of precincts and number of polling places, and locations are the same. You still have to each year, actually schedule by board action the election date, as well as these designating the polling places in the precincts. That has to happen every year, even if it doesn't change. So the one thing I should say is that once, in terms of the polling place, once it is established by the board, that polling place actually has to remain a polling place for the precinct unless it is changed by a subsequent action of the board. So something to keep in mind too. Okay, so once you set the polling places, the board is required to set poll hours and appoint election judges and election clerks. So in terms of polling hours, there is no deadline by which the board has to set poll hours. But I think it's pretty common that when you designate polling places, you're also setting the poll hours at that time. The law prohibits you from scheduling polling hours any earlier than 7 a.m., but you have to have them open by 11 a.m., and that would be in your local time. In your local time zone. And then the polling places must remain open until at least 7 p.m. However, they cannot be open any later than 8 p.m. A question is, so even if it stays the same until the board changes, you have to have board action every year. I believe, yes, that's my interpretation of the law. And the reason for that is you still need to consider whether the polling places are as conveniently located as possible for your electors. You're still required to designate precincts every year. So yes, I think, you could do all of this at the time that you set the date of the election. I think that would be appropriate. Certainly at the time that you are setting poll hours and appointing election judges and clerks for the polling place. So in terms of those judges and clerks, you have to appoint at least 2 election judges and at least 2 election clerks for each polling place. I have board action with a question mark here because I do get a lot of questions, and I have in the last couple of election cycles. I think kind of the common practice is that the business manager just goes ahead and finds election workers, and there doesn't seem to always be board action to appoint that. The law says that the board is required to appoint 2 election judges and 2 election clerks for each polling place. So I think board action is required. Now, could you set it up where the board delegates the authority to appoint those judges for that particular election to your business manager? Possibly. But I think, what I generally recommend is that the business manager go ahead and do the work of identifying those judges and clerks, and then recommends to the board and have the board officially appoint those particular election judges and clerks once the business manager identifies those folks. Those election workers and clerks have to take an affirmation or oath before the polls open on election day. The language of that affirmation and oath is found in section 16.10502 subpart 3. I say here more on this later, and that's from another more comprehensive election presentation that I did. I don't actually go into more detail on election clerks and election workers in terms of what their qualifications are, but there are requirements in terms of qualifications. They have to be an elector in your district in order to act as an election judge or election clerk. And they have to be a certain age. And so and they actually have to be from the same precinct, an elector in the precinct if you have multiple precincts. So if you have any questions on qualifications of judges and clerks, please feel free to call me. Okay, we have a couple of questions here. I already did that one, so let's clear that one out. Okay, so how do school board judges and clerks know their jobs? Great question. Well, hopefully the school district business manager is your election expert for all intents and purposes. And so it's really important that your business manager be trained and very knowledgeable about all of the election, not only the statutory deadlines and requirements, but also how they actually function on election day. And so in terms of your business manager should be trained in that sense. And then the business manager is responsible then for making sure the judges and clerks that are appointed know what they need to do and what their duties are on election day. I will cover that a little bit and not in detail because we don't have enough time today, but I will cover that in a bit. But essentially the answer to the question is, the district should be providing a certain level of training to their judges and clerks to make sure that they understand what their responsibilities are. We've talked with the Secretary of State's office in trying to coordinate election training, not only for business managers, but also potentially for workers and for election workers, or at least providing something that, some training to the business manager so that the business manager can then appropriately advise the workers what their responsibilities are on the election day. Okay. Is there any restrictions on when you can set our polling hours to start at 11 a.m. rather than 9 a.m.? I thought I read something once about the number of votes cast in the previous election was a deciding factor. I am not aware of anything regarding the number of votes cast being a relevant factor in setting polling hours. I haven't heard of that. You can, as a board, the board can set the polling hours to open at 11 a.m., but you can't do it any earlier than 7 a.m. So anytime between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. on election day, that is when they have to be open. So you can make that change depending on what the needs of your district are. I think I answered the other one. So where does the business manager get training? Well, we offer training through our business manager certification course. If you haven't taken that, you do get election training that way. We can provide training to your business manager if that's something you're interested in. Again, we have talked with the Secretary of State's office to try to get election training available to school election officials or business managers. So I think that's something that we will have available maybe this summer. So stay tuned. We'll let you know how much we get done on that. Great question. Is there anything that could be reported on the statement of interest that would disqualify a candidate from running? Amy, I'm going to save this question until we get to the school board candidate portion of the presentation because I'm going to cover that briefly there. So I'll hold on to that question. So kind of the next thing in the process, the next step is publishing the notice of election. And that has to happen at least 14 days prior to election date. It has to be published in the official newspaper of the district. It has to include the time and place of the election and the purpose of the vote. So here's a sample notice of election. This is included as an exhibit to our BBA policy if you have our template policies. And this is, it includes all of the required information. So the date and time of the of the election and what the purpose of the election is, but it also includes a little bit more information. So precincts and polling location and address information. So we suggest that you use this form for your notice. So that is essentially takes us all the way up to election day. So those are the pre-election deadlines. I wanted just put a place card here. Depending on, let's say you have a special election, there might be some additional steps that you have to take depending on the question that is on the ballot. So sometimes there are some additional requirements, but these are going to be the general requirements that are going to apply in all school elections, regardless of the question being put before the voters. So we're getting to election day, and there are a number of things that occur on election day. And I've kind of split it into before the polls open, after the polls open, and then after the polls close. So here are a number of things, and these are going to generally be the responsibility of the school business manager. To make sure all of these things are accomplished. So this is a list of the main things that have to happen. So clerks and judges have to have taken their oath or affirmation. If they haven't done that yet, that has to happen before the polls open. Business manager assigns duties to the workers. Make sure they have everything they need to carry out those duties. You want to make sure you review your ballots and materials to make sure they are all correct. So that wouldn't be waiting until the morning of. That would be something that you do prior to election day, hopefully. Make sure that you have the appropriate number of election booths and compartments. There are requirements for that in North Dakota law. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. You want to post voting instructions and a copy of the section of the code that deals with election offenses. That's something that you should be posting at your polling places. You want to post a copy of the official ballot, the complete text of any measures that you're putting on the ballot, and maps of precinct boundaries if you have multiple precincts. So all of this is being posted somewhere in the polling place. Post on the door the date and hours of the polling place. Let's see. And there's a whole host of other things, but the other thing, you have to display the United States flag at each polling place. That's a federal requirement. I'm not sure, hopefully everybody is aware of that, but it's just something to keep in mind. Question on the notice of election. Does it need to be placed in the legal notices section of the newspaper, or can you post an ad or on another page of the newspaper? Great question. The law doesn't specify, so it is not required to be in the legal notices. I think that's often where it happens, but you could certainly take out an ad. You can take out a full page ad if you want. The requirement is just that it be published. So you have a little bit of discretion there. So moving on, so on election day, after the polls open, there are a number of things to keep in mind. As you can see, I'm not going to go through all of them, but a couple of them are, this is where you're going to want to make sure that clerks are keeping an accurate and correct poll book. You're going to be providing instructions, or your workers are going to be providing instructions to voters. Voters who might need assistance to complete their ballot. There's some allowance for that, although there are some limitations. Judges are going to have to be initialing ballots before handing them to the voter with a secrecy sleeve. So that's something that has to happen after polls open. So yeah, there's a number of things that occur on election day. And again, most of this is going to be the responsibility of the school business manager, but I think it's important for not only the business manager to know, but also for the board to know, so that you can understand that your business manager has a huge responsibility on election day. And so making sure that they have adequate training, that they have adequate number of workers to help complete all of these tasks is really important. So I thought I would throw a lot of this at you so that you understand, yeah, our business manager has a lot of tasks to complete. So we want to make sure that we put them in the best position to get them done in the right way. Can the U.S. flag be at the door entrance? I think so. Technically it has to be displayed at the polling place, so probably inside the polling place is preferred, although I'm not sure if the law probably doesn't get down to that level of details. Do we have to canvass the votes on the 6th day? What if we have someone on vacation or not in town, like the business manager or board members? We'll get to canvass the canvas piece of this in a bit, but the answer to that is you have to canvass on the 6th day after the election. That is the requirement. There is no room for discretion there. We have a flag outside of the polling place. Does it need to be inside by the polling booths? It doesn't. I would say, you know, I would have it inside the polling place, but I don't think there's going to be a huge problem if it's right outside the door. But I mean, to avoid any potential issue, I think having the US flag displayed inside. It just says that it has to be, I'm just going to move back here. The display the United States flag at each polling place. It just says at the polling place. It doesn't say inside, outside. It just says at. So I think there's probably a little bit of room for discretion. So once the polls close, there are a number of things that need to happen, which are listed here. The judges count and canvass the votes, the election judges, upon closing of the polls. The canvass must continue without adjournment until completed, and that canvassing by the judges, that counting by the judges has to be open to the public. So the public gets to observe that. They don't get to, you know, hover over the judge's shoulders, but they do get to view it. So you'll want to kind of set it up so if you have people observing. And as we all know from this the kind of the national elections that occurred, election observers have I think kind of that activity I think is going to rise. And so you should be prepared that members of the public may want to watch that process. Do you need a secrecy envelope for in-person voting? Yes, you do. They need to be able, well, I need to walk that back. I'm not sure if it's a requirement to have a secrecy envelope, but I believe so. I believe that is because you want to give it so that when they walk their ballots to and from the ballot box, that they have the ability to hide that that ballot in the from view of other people that are there. I'm not quite sure about the requirement there, so I'll have to look that up and confirm. So if you still need an answer to that question, feel free to email me. Okay, so after the judges complete the canvass on election night, the judges and clerks have to sign the returns and then file those returns with the business manager. We have election return forms as well if you don't have one or like to see some different examples of return reports. The business manager, all of the ballots, once they're counted, have to be wrapped and returned to the business manager. And then the business manager is required to secure the ballots in fireproof storage so that they can await canvassing by the school board on the 6th day. Reports, both poll books, OLs, any other required materials are also delivered to the business manager before leaving the polling location that day. Question, if the ballot is only one page, can they just fold it? Again, I'm not sure about that secrecy envelope requirement. So just as a matter of explanation, so all of these requirements regarding what happens in terms of the actual voting process on election day all of these requirements are what the county auditors come from, the county auditor training that the state does. And so they require that the voter be provided a secrecy envelope when they are provided their ballot. And you would essentially give them the ballot in a secrecy envelope. They can take it into the compartment or booth, complete the ballot, and then place it back into the secrecy envelope and then placed in the ballot box. Okay, so after election night comes and goes, we have the canvass by the school board. That again has to happen on the 6th day following the election. So not only do they have to canvass the returns, but they also have to declare a result. That is an open public meeting of the school board and has to be properly noticed and accessible to the public. So something to keep in mind, you'll still have to follow all of your notice requirements. There's a section of the code 16.1-15-01 that talks about when you're canvassing, how you determine which ballots are void and not counted. I'm not going to go through that now, but there is some direction in law about that. The individual that receives the highest number of votes for each office must be declared elected. If there is a tie, which does happen, there is some direction on what needs to happen that in a school board election in particular, and that's going to be found in 15.10916. The board is required to record the result of the election and prepare a canvass report. And so if you need forms for any of that, let me know. But your school district business manager should have that. Okay, so once the canvass occurs and a winner or winners are declared, those winners must be informed within 3 days of the canvassing that they have been elected, and they need to also, and that has to be in writing, and they also must be informed of their duty to take an oath or affirmation of office. That has to occur, and I'll go right here. So that's the notice to winners. And then once the winners are notified, they have 10 days to, after receiving the notice of the election, to take that oath or affirmation. And they have to do that before they can commence their duties. If they don't take the oath or affirmation within that 10 days, then they cannot be seated, and that creates a vacancy. Within 10 days after the canvass, the school business manager is also required to certify the individuals that are elected and their terms to the county superintendent of schools for your particular county. So that's something to make sure that you do at the end of the process. Okay, a few more things to note. And I'm going to cover this in a little bit later when we talk about school board candidates, but if the individual that is declared the winner does not meet the qualifications for office, so let's say, for example, they're not a resident, or they fail to take that oath or affirmation, or what happens if they say, you know what, maybe they're a write-in candidate and the write-in got the most votes, and they're like, you know what, no, I don't want to sit on the school board. In that case, it doesn't just go to the next highest vote getter. A vacancy occurs pursuant to North Dakota law. And once a vacancy occurs, that vacancy is required to be filled by the board pursuant to the process set forth in section 15.10905. I'm not going to go through that process, but essentially the board must appoint or fill the vacancy by special election within 60 days of the vacancy occurring. So it's a relatively quick turnaround time. We do have a template policy that a lot of boards adopt that addresses filling vacancies and has some requirements in there. And so that is policy BBC. So that might be something you guys will want to take a look at if you ever get into that situation. The term of office for any board member that is elected at the annual election begins at the annual meeting in July following the election. So that's when the term starts. That's specific in North Dakota law. So I often get the question, what happens? Can the board meet and take action and conduct business between election day and the annual meeting in July when the new board member or members will be seated? And the answer to that is yes. There's nothing that prohibits the current board from meeting and conducting business up until the new board members are seated in July. Okay, so that's school board or school election procedural process. I kind of covered it fast, but in the interest of time, I wanted to move forward with school board candidates. Oh, okay. So we have a question here. What physical actions must board members do to properly canvass the votes? We usually have the business manager read the results of the judge's canvass and the board moves to accept those results. Is this sufficient? No, that's not sufficient. The board actually has to count the ballots. And oftentimes the judge's canvass likely will not match that. If you relied only on the judge's canvass, what happens if you receive absentee ballots after the date of the election? Those are not, if they're postmarked the day before the election, they might be received following the date of the election and wouldn't be included in the judge's canvassing. And so, and there might be ballots that were set aside as defective, and the canvassing board or the school board has to pass on the sufficiency of those and declare whether they should be counted or not. And so the board actually canvasses the votes. They have to count. So the judge's canvass on election night does not take the place of that. Good question. Good question. Okay, so who may run for a seat on a local school board? So any individual who is a qualified elector of this state may serve as a school board member for the school district in which the individual resides. So that's kind of that's the end all of it. If they are a qualified elector in the state, they are allowed to run for a school board in the district in which they reside. So a qualified elector has to be a citizen of the United States who is at least 18 years or older, and they have to be a resident of the state and a resident of the school district for 30 days preceding the election. So that's all that they have to, the requirements they have to meet. There is an additional eligibility requirement for public school districts that are located within the exterior boundaries of an Indian reservation. That's tied to criminal background. So if you're a tribal district that is located, I should say a public school district that's located within the exterior boundaries of a reservation, if your tribal government has eligibility requirements relating to criminal background to run for tribal office, those same criminal background requirements apply to the public school board in that district. Again, this is only for districts that are located within the exterior boundaries of an Indian reservation. So a couple of questions. What happens if a candidate submits a statement of intent and a statement of interest by the candidate filing deadline, but they aren't a resident of the district? What do? As long as they've completed the required filings, you put them on the ballot because they're only required to be a resident at least 30 days prior to the election. So it may be that they're moving into the district and they want to, after the deadline happens, and they want to be considered for the school board. So you can't decide at the candidate filing deadline if they're eligible. It's actually if they meet if they get the highest number of votes and are going to be seated, that's when you determine if they're eligible. What if the individual receiving the highest number of votes is no longer eligible? Kind of covered that already, but basically that creates a vacancy. It does not mean that the second highest vote getter gets the seat. It means that the board must now appoint or fill the vacancy by special election. What about, and then I have another question here. What about geographic voting areas? And so we've been getting a lot of questions about this. Sometime several decades ago, a lot of public school districts in North Dakota divvied up their district into separate geographic areas. And these are not reorganized districts. Reorganized districts are treated differently. So they're not quite relevant to what I'm going to tell you, but for some reason, non-reorganized districts did this several years ago. And they did this so that they could pull members from different geographic areas within the district, probably for the purpose of making sure that different areas of the district were represented on the board. And so I've gotten a lot of questions lately whether, I think a lot of those folks are starting to find problems getting people to run for open seats in those geographic areas, specifically the rural areas. And so they're wondering, well, can we just change to all at large? And I kind of tell them, well, frankly, I don't even know if you can divide up under current law. You cannot divide up your district into these different geographic areas unless you're reorganized. That allows you to do that under your reorganization plan. The other thing that potentially affects where you pull board members from are rural board member requirements. So if your district meets certain requirements, you have to have a certain number of board members who are considered rural board members. But other than that, any qualified elector is allowed to serve on the school board, assuming they, and run for school board. So something to keep in mind. I think there might be a lot of districts that are in that. I've had, surprisingly, more than a handful of districts that find themselves in the spot where they're not a reorganized district, but yet they've sometime in the past, they had their district divided into these different geographic areas, and they are pulling board members from those geographic areas. So couple of questions. If a vacancy occurs, is the appointed or special election just for 1 year? So I think what it means is, how long does the person that's filling the vacancy, how long do they serve? So the appointment or special election, however you do it, that only lasts until a successor can be elected at the next regular election. So it depends on what time in the year you are appointing somebody to fill the vacancy, but that seat has to be on the ballot of the next regular election to fill that a vacancy permanently. And basically, once that successor is elected, the successor then completes the remainder of the term from the individual that caused the vacancy to occur. So if it's something where a candidate who received the highest vote at the annual election isn't eligible, and so that creates a vacancy, that the individual who the board appoints to fill the vacancy would serve until the next regular election where a successor would be appointed. And then the successor, who could very well be the same person that was appointed, would then complete the remaining term, whatever is left on that term. Okay. So if the district has a seat from a rural area up for election and says that normally in the northeast section of the district, could legally someone from the rural area south in the district run? Is that what you are saying? Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. So again, the rural board member requirements, those are found in chapter 15.109. So let's say you have to have at least 2 board members on your board have to be rural board members. So basically, the rural board member is defined in North Dakota law, and I don't know it off the top of my head, but basically they have to reside on a farm outside of an incorporated city. And there's another part of the definition I'm blanking on right now, but basically anybody within the district that qualifies as a rural board member would be able to fill that rural board member requirement for your district. So it doesn't matter if they're from the Northeast or from the South. If they qualify as a rural board member, they are eligible to run for that rural board member seat. What happens if you have 3 open seats and only receive filing paperwork from 2 people? So that third seat could be filled by a write-in. That would be fine. It kind of depends on, sometimes you have if all of the open seats have the same term, then if you have 3 open and you can only fill by 2, then you'd have a vacancy in the one, and then you would fill that vacancy like you normally would fill any vacancy. But let's say you have 2 candidates, and then they get the highest number of votes for those 2 seats, and then the 3rd seat is a write-in candidate, then you would have filled all of the seats at the election. I hope that's clear. We're running out of time, so I'm going to hurry quick through this other one. We oftentimes get the question if whether employees can run for the school board. The answer to that is yes. Nothing prohibits a current employee, regardless of the position, from running for the school board. However, if that person is ultimately elected, they may very well need to make a choice between employment and sitting on the board. The clearest examples of that are teachers and administrators. You cannot be both a teacher or administrator and a school board member in the same district. You have to choose. Those have been determined to be incompatible positions. Classified staff, like a bus driver or maybe a cook, that's a little bit of more of a gray area. I think some people, and I think me included, believe that there is some flexibility for some positions in the district. I know some people disagree with me, but that's how I feel about it. But at the end of the day, most boards have a policy about employees running for school board, and that is our policy BAA. And generally that policy prohibits board members from being employed. And so if you have that policy, I think clearly your board has spoken and said employees cannot also be on the school board. Now, it doesn't mean an employee can't run for a school board, but once they're elected, that might require them to choose between the two. What about spouses of employees? Nothing, that is not a prohibition either. What it might do is it might create, if the spouse of an employee is ultimately elected, it would likely raise conflicts of interest when certain issues come before the board, and you would have to handle that appropriately. Okay, to finish out today, I wanted to talk about corrupt practices. So there are a list of things that would be considered a corrupt practice in terms of elections. The piece I wanted to focus on today is the prohibition against a political subdivision providing services or property in furtherance of a public purpose. So what that means essentially is a school district cannot use its services or property in furtherance of a public purpose. And a public purpose is defined as any activity that's undertaken in support of or in opposition to a political subdivision, ballot measure, or the election or nomination of an individual candidate for public office. So really where this question and this issue often comes up in is when a board has decided to put a bond referendum on the ballot. The board is obviously has a reason why it's putting a bond referendum on. It wants to build a new school, and everybody feels like that's a good thing and a need for the district. Otherwise, they would not put that on the ballot. And so the question is often, well, can we encourage people to come and vote? Possibly. You can give them factual information regarding the referendum for the purpose of educating them on, the needs of the district and why the referendum has been put on the ballot. However, you cannot, use the district communication system, email system, to encourage people to vote for the bond referendum. That would be considered a corrupt practice. Can you use a school board or school district letterhead to send out information on the election and reasons why the referendum was put on the ballot? Possibly, but you have to be very careful that you're not encouraging a vote for the referendum or a vote against the referendum. The other thing is you also want to be careful that individual employees aren't using their school email address to campaign for a candidate for school election, a school board election. That would likely be considered a corrupt practice. So that is kind of where this issue comes up in most often is, okay, we have a bond referendum. We want people to know, have people to have information. Can we provide information? Yes, you can, but it has to be factual and it has to be solely for the purpose of educating voters. You cannot advocate for or against the measure question. So hopefully that's clear. So a couple of things to keep in mind on this. Property includes motor vehicles, telephones, typewriters. You can tell this is outdated. Adding machines, postage meters, funds of money of the district or buildings. So you can't use district property to further a political purpose. You also can't use services, which includes employees during regular business hours. And so you can't use them, employees for, let's say sending out vote in favor of the bond referendum, question. You can't do that. Any person that violates that section of the code or that chapter can be guilty of a Class A misdemeanor. So it's a pretty serious thing to keep in mind. All right, that's all I have. I know I went through this very fast, but with only an hour, there's so much meat to this subject that I kind of found it difficult to get it all in, but I hope I provided some meaningful information. Daniel, yes, this is recorded. The recording will be available on our events page following. I'm not sure if it'll be up today, but it'll be up in the next few days, as well as a copy of my my PowerPoint presentation. So that'll be available to everyone. The person that has questions about the geographic areas, will you please give me a call, and I'd be happy to chat with you generally about that subject. I've had a lot of calls on that. Before I let you go, I wanted to get back to Amy's question. Is there anything that could be reported on the statement of interest that would disqualify a candidate from running? I hope I kind of answered that already, but just to confirm, there's really, the time for determining eligibility is not the candidate filing deadline. It's at the time that the individual is elected to the board. So if that's when you determine eligibility. So hopefully that answers your question. It looks like I've covered all of the questions that are in the Q&A. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and hopefully I provided some information. If you guys need anything else on elections, give our office a call. We do have a lot of resources. We're in the process of preparing an election handbook. There might be some changes to that depending on what happens in the legislative session, which we're very close to completing. But like I said, there's a large election administration bill that's still in conference committee that will have some important changes that do apply to school district elections. So keep a lookout for guidance on that. Our next Lunch and Learn will be May 19th, 2021, not 2020. I'm still living in 2020. I don't know why anybody would still want to be there, but I'm there apparently in my brain. Again at noon. The subject is going to be updating school board policy. So it's a really valuable thing to sit through, because you guys constantly have to update and revise your policies, and Rebecca from our office, our policy director, is going to give you a lot of valuable procedural information on that. And then again, go to our resources or events page, frankly, to get information on that and to register for that. Other than that, I think that completes our session today. Thank you again for joining us. And as always, please give a call to our office with any questions. Thank you so much.